You file a simple request. That's all this is. At first, a piece of paper asking a government for records it's legally obligated to keep. You've done this before, maybe for something boring, a property record, a court transcript, the kind of paperwork that always comes back eventually, stamped and stapled, and slightly disappointing in how ordinary it turns out to be. This time it's different, because this time you're asking for something that should be structurally impossible to lose, an entire national archive of UFO sightings, decades deep, filed by pilots who radioed in things they couldn't identify, by radar operators who watched blips do things blips aren't supposed to do, by ordinary citizens who looked up on an ordinary night and saw something that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. And 2 months later, the answer comes back, written in the flat, procedural language governments use specifically when they don't want to sound as strange as what they're actually telling you. The file could not be located, not classified, not denied, not pending further review, lost. Every case, every photograph, every handwritten witness statement, gone, and nobody left in the building can tell you when it happened, how it happened, or why it happened to be this file, out of every file in the archive that stopped existing. Stay with me for the next 20 minutes, because this isn't a conspiracy theory dressed up as a documentary. This actually happened. It's sitting in the public record right now, verifiable, dated, on paper. And the deeper you go into how a modern government loses something this large, the less it starts to sound like an accident, and the more it starts to sound like a decision nobody ever had to make out loud. Picture a records office, the kind of place that looks almost identical in every country on Earth. Fluorescent lighting that hums just slightly too loud, rows of gray filing cabinets stretching further back than the ceiling lights reach, the low mechanical drone of climate control that never quite shuts off because paper this old can't survive humidity. Somewhere inside a building like this, a Freedom of Information request lands on someone's desk, not a dramatic request, not framed as an accusation, just a plain administrative ask. Locate and release all official records relating to unidentified flying object sightings collected by the military over the preceding several decades. The clerk assigned to it does exactly what anyone trained for this job would do. They pull up the index. They cross-reference the file classification. They walk down the aisle to the shelf where a collection this size, this historically significant, should be sitting, thick, bound, labeled in the same handwriting conventions used across 100 other boxes just like it. And it isn't there. Not misfiled 2 shelves over. Not checked out to another department and forgotten in transit. Not sitting in an unlabeled box waiting its turn to be digitized. Simply absent in the specific, hollow way that makes a person standing in front of an empty shelf go quiet for a beat longer than professional composure usually allows, because everyone who has ever worked in records management knows the exact difference between "we haven't located it yet" and that colder, sinking certainty that the search is about to fail completely, and that failure is going to have to be explained to someone eventually. Here's where the story stops being about one missing folder on one particular shelf and starts becoming something you can't unsee once the shape of it comes into focus. The search that follows isn't quick. It takes roughly 2 months, not 2 days, not 2 weeks, 2 full months of officials working methodically through secondary storage sites, cross-checking decades-old internal memos, tracking down retired staff who might, if they're lucky, still remember which building a set of records got transferred to sometime in the 1980s or 90s. And what eventually comes back from all of that effort isn't nothing. It's arguably worse than nothing, because it's almost nothing. One single surviving folder out of what should have been an entire program's worth of case files, containing a scattered, incomplete record of sightings tied to a remote military weapons testing range, a location already wrapped in layers of unrelated secrecy for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with flying saucers, which only adds another layer of static to an already blurry picture. Everything else connected to that program, the interviews, the sketches, the correspondence between field offices and headquarters, the follow-up reports, simply isn't there. Not one file. Not one drawer's worth. An entire multi-decade archive compressed down to a single folder thin enough to hold comfortably in one hand. And here's the detail that should genuinely stop you cold. The detail that turns this from a sad story about bad filing into something you have to sit with. Officials later confirmed, on the record, that a private, unofficial UFO research group working with none of the legal authority, funding, or institutional access the government itself had already independently located and copied several of these exact same missing files years before the official search even began. which means the documents didn't quietly dissolve into some unknowable point in ancient administrative history. They existed. They were locatable, physically, by ordinary civilians with persistence and no security clearance at all. And then, at some specific point between a hobbyist finding them and a government institution looking for them, they stopped being locatable to the very organization that created them in the first place. So the real question isn't whether the files are gone. That's confirmed, formally, in writing, by the institution itself. The real question, the one nobody in that records office wants their name attached to, is this: how does an organization built entirely around the discipline of keeping records manage to lose the single category of record that happens to be the most publicly requested, the most historically significant, and the most likely to end up in a headline, and lose only that category cleanly while everything else around it survives? This is where it stops being abstract and starts becoming personal, because once you sit with this long enough, you inevitably start doing what every serious researcher who's ever touched this case eventually does. You start mentally reconstructing what missing could actually mean in practice, and none of the honest answers leave you comfortable. Possibility one, the boring one, the one records professionals will tell you privately is statistically the most common explanation for cases like this: simple bureaucratic decay. Old paper archives get physically relocated between buildings over the decades. Storage contracts expire and get replaced by cheaper vendors who don't inherit institutional memory. Budgets get cut in years nobody remembers, and a junior clerk in some forgotten fiscal year makes a routine filing decision that nobody questions or double checks until it's 30 or 40 years too late to reverse it. Institutions lose things constantly, not out of any hidden intention, but because in the actual mechanics of running a bureaucracy for half a century, nobody was ever specifically, personally, permanently responsible for making sure any one file survived that long. This explanation is unglamorous. It doesn't make for a dramatic thumbnail, and it's also, honestly, statistically the most probable one. Most institutional disappearances really are exactly this mundane, this human, this forgettable. But then there's a second possibility, and this one doesn't require any conspiracy at all, just an understanding of how institutions protect their own reputations. Quiet embarrassment. A collection of decades-old official reports written by trained military officers whose careers and credibility depended on being taken seriously, describing objects they could not identify using every resource available to them at the time, sitting in a government archive, waiting patiently to be requested by exactly the kind of persistent researcher who eventually did request it, is not, structurally, a file most institutions are eager to have found intact. Not necessarily because it proves anything extraordinary about what those officers actually saw, because it proves nothing definitively, one way or the other, and very few things embarrass a serious, image-conscious institution faster than being publicly associated in a national newspaper. With a decades-old mystery, it can neither confidently resolve nor confidently dismiss. And then there's a third possibility, the one you can't prove, can't disprove, and can't quite set down either once it's occurred to you, that somewhere in the space between recovered independently by outside researchers and searched for exhaustively by officials, a decision got made, quietly, informally, by someone whose name will never surface in any of this, that the file was simply more useful to the institution missing than found. 3 plausible explanations, 0 official confirmation of which one is actually true. And that unresolved, uncomfortable space between honest bureaucratic accident and quiet institutional decision is precisely where every serious person who has ever seriously investigated this case ends up stuck, sometimes for years, sometimes, by their own admission, for the rest of their working life. So here's where this actually leaves you, and I'm not going to pretend it resolves the way a well-built thriller is supposed to, because real records offices don't hand out clean, satisfying endings. They hand you a formal letter quietly admitting failure, and then they close the file on the failure itself, and everyone involved moves on to the next request in the queue. The government's final, official position, stated plainly on the public record, was this: the file is deemed lost. Not found later with an explanation attached. Not declassified upon further review. Deemed lost. 4 words that do an enormous, almost elegant amount of quiet institutional work, because they legally and procedurally allow an organization to stop looking without ever having to publicly account for why the looking stopped when it did, or who made that call, or what, if anything, happened to the material in between. What survived from all of it, that single recovered folder, plus the fragments a private research group had already independently pulled together on their own time, with their own resources, is genuinely, verifiably, all that remains of what should have been one of the more complete official UFO archives in that government's entire modern history. And the uncomfortable truth sitting quietly underneath all of this was never really about extraterrestrials at all. It's about what it actually means that a modern, professionally staffed, well-funded government records system can lose an entire, historically significant category of its own institutional memory and never be required to fully explain how. Because if this happened purely by accident, that's a story about institutional fragility on a scale most people never think about how much of what a government actually knows, about anything, sits only one careless filing decision, one budget cut, one forgotten storage transfer away from disappearing permanently and irretrievably. And if it happened by quiet choice instead, that's an entirely different, far more unsettling story. One about exactly what institutions are willing to let vanish silently rather than ever have to defend publicly, on the record, under scrutiny. Nobody has ever conclusively proven which one this actually was. Nobody may ever be able to prove it, not with the material that remains. And that, honestly, is the part that should sit with you longer than any tidy conspiracy ever could. Not the possibility that something specific was deliberately hidden from you, but the much quieter, much heavier realization that we may never actually be able to tell the difference between something hidden on purpose and something simply, carelessly, permanently lost, and that the not knowing itself is the only part of this story that was never up for debate. If this pulled you in the way it pulled me in while going through the original reporting and the archival record, hit subscribe, because this channel breaks down exactly this kind of real, documented, still unresolved mystery every single week, not fabricated ones, real ones with paper trails you can actually go check yourself. And drop a comment right now telling me which explanation you personally believe carries the most weight here. Honest bureaucratic accident, quiet institutional embarrassment, or something closer to a deliberate, unrecorded decision. I read every single comment on these videos, and more than a few of the best leads for future deep dives have come directly out of this comment section. I'll see you in the next one.